Hi, and welcome to the Knitting Skills Proficiency tutorial. Today we're going to talk about knitting in the round on 2 circular cable needles. I'm going to do it slightly differently for this tutorial. I'm going to do a really quick and easy intro into the 3 areas of knitting on 2 circular needles, so that if you just need a really overview and you can pick it up quickly, great. Or if you need a detailed, in-depth deep dive into a particular area, I'll give you the, down in comments of the video, I will give you quick links to that section of the video where you can look at a more detailed version of it. So the 3 things that I want to go through today are when to use the technique of knitting in the round on 2 circular cable needles. The second is going to be switching from 1 needle to 2 needles when you're knitting in the round, and actually how to knit in the round on 2 circular needles. There's a very simple technique to do it. And the third is kind of a tips and tricks on, if you don't have 2 of the same size circular cable needles, how you can kind of trick that if you have an interchangeable set where you only have 2 tips of the same size, but you want to create 2 separate cable needles with that. There's a tip and trick that I can show you on how to do that. So let's go with the first topic. The first topic is when to use this technique of 2 circular needles in the round. So basically there's a simple premise. If the number of stitches that you have on your needle are insufficient, you don't have enough stitches to comfortably stretch around the needle, then you want to switch to any other technique other than 1 single cable needle to knit in the round. You could use double points, you could use magic loop technique, which there are tons of tutorials out there on how to do that, or you could do knitting in the round on 2 circular needles. The second topic I'd like to discuss a little bit is how to switch from 1 needle to 2 needles in knitting in the round, and once you switch to 2 needles, how to actually knit on 2 circular needles in the round. There's just a very simple technique for doing it, so I'm going to go through that quickly, and then if you want an in-depth description of kind of the techniques behind it, you can switch to, just click on the link down below for switching to 2 cable circular needles, and it'll take you directly to a more in-depth review of that. So there's basically 3 parts to this, to starting to work in the round on 2 circular cable needles. I typically like to start at my the beginning of my round. In this case, this is the beginning of my round. And basically all I do to initiate starting to knit in the round on 2 circular cable needles is I get my same size second circular needle, and I just start to knit onto that needle instead of using the lead edge of the old needle. And I knit approximately half my stitches onto the new needle. In this case, I've got 80 needles across my stitch, so I'm going to put across my needle. So I'm going to put 40 stitches onto the second needle. And so I still have 40 stitches on the old needle and 40 stitches on the new needle. So from a quick and dirty perspective, when you go to actually knit on 2 circular needles in the round, you're going to always make sure that you use the same 2 ends of the same needle when you're actually knitting. So what that means is, if I'm knitting this stitch off of this tip, I want to use the end of that needle to be able to do that. That makes sense? So in essence, since this needle comes out here, this is the end of this needle tip, I want to make sure I'm using the same needle always. And basically what I do is I knit the 40 stitches on the old needle now using the end of the old needle, the first needle that I started with. Okay, so now we've gotten to the end of that needle, and you'll see that we've taken all the stitches off that original needle and moved them onto the other side of that same needle. And again, we come back to that same oval shape where the next stitch to be knit, and you pull that needle through, the next stitch to be knit is off of that needle tip, and you need to make sure that you're using the proper end of the same needle to knit those stitches. So the last topic on this tutorial is a trick that I use when I don't have two of the same size circular needles in my set of needles. So for instance, if I'm knitting a hat on US 8 or 5mm needles, and I only have one set of circular needles in size 8, I can't really do knitting in the round on two circular needles, except if I have an interchangeable set. There's a way of tricking your system. Since interchangeables allow you to have two different sizes of tips on each side of your circular needle cable, then it allows you to create this hybrid needle that has the working tip on the working side of the correct size. So for instance, I can put a US 8 or 5mm tip onto one side and a US 7 on the other side. Because your working needle is what establishes the size of your stitch and the gauge. The trailing needle, the side that it comes off on, it doesn't establish anything about gauge. And so I actually create these hybrid needles where on one side, the working side, I use the needle size that the pattern calls for, in this case an 8, and on the trailing end of that same needle cable, I put one smaller size, or a US 7 in this particular case, and I do the same with the other. That gives me two hybrid needles. Since I only work with one side of my circular needle when I'm knitting in the round on two circulars, I always work with the US 8 side. If you want a little bit more detailed information about how to trick your system, I'll tell you a little bit more about the pieces of it if you click on the link to the more in-depth review of hybrid needle sizes on your circular cable needles. One of the things that I always use as a determining factor as to when I will use the knitting on two circular needles in the round is how comfortable I am moving the stitches along the cable needle. So for instance, as I start to knit this round, very quickly I get to the place where there's a stiffness in the feed of the stitches up onto the needle that I'm about to knit, and it takes more and more pressure to pull those stitches up. And basically the engineering that takes place is, as you're starting to pull these stitches, you're getting a glut of stitches over here on the stitches that you've just knit, but on this side it's starting to pull, and as it pulls, it actually makes it more tension on the gradual increase onto the needle, and makes it harder and harder to pull those stitches up onto the needle. You can easily reduce that by just moving your stitches around and then pull these up, and it's with relative ease you can do that. But again, as you start to knit some of those newly pushed up stitches onto your right needle, you'll find yourself having to do that over and over again. Now, sometimes it's worth the effort of doing that because I don't have to change. I don't have to go to like double pointed needles, or I don't have to switch needles even on two circular needles when I'm doing this. And it can be a faster knit for things like a hat knit in the round. But at one point, even when you get up to a hat knit in the round, when you start to do decreases for the crown, you're going to find that you're not going to have enough stitches to fully comfortably go all the way around your cable needle, and so you're going to want to switch to some other form of knitting in the round. So that's the basic premise of when to use knitting in the round on two circular needles. When you don't have enough stitches to comfortably stretch around the length of the cable needle that you're using. So one of the things you'll see is it's starting to tighten up because we're taking it off the old needle. All you need to do is take the lead section of the old needle and pull it through to move those stitches along that cable, and then pull them up onto the trailing section of that same needle as you continue to knit them off. So let me just arrange these needles slightly so that you can kind of see what we've got. I've moved 40 stitches to the new needle by knitting them off the old needle. And so I still have 40 stitches on the old needle and 40 stitches on the new needle. And I'm going to show you this trick and technique. A lot of people have a problem saying that knitting with two circulars is like it's too floppy for them. And some people describe it as knitting with an octopus, that there's so many arms hanging around. But one of the things that I found is easy to do is when I've knit 4 or 5 stitches onto the next needle, I pull this one out for 2 reasons. One is so that I don't have too much of a gap between the join of those 2 needles, but the other is so that I can kind of just relax that needle, that unused needle tip in the crook of my thumb and forefinger, and I just carry it along with me. It does 2 things. One is it keeps it from flopping around, but 2, and it doesn't get in the way while I'm doing that, but 2, it also reminds me that when I get to the end of this side, that I can just pick up that needle directly from the crook of my finger and thumb and use it to start the next round. So let's get to the end of this half of the round. That's just my tail. Okay, so now we've gotten to the end of that needle, and you'll see that we've taken all the stitches off that original needle and moved them onto the other side of that same needle. And again, we come back to that same oval shape where the next stitch to be knit, and you pull that needle through, the next stitch to be knit is off of that needle tip, and you need to make sure that you're using the proper end of the same needle to knit those stitches. So just make sure you're always using the same ends of the same needle to be able to do your knitting. Otherwise you'll get in a twist. So we'll do one more round using the same 2 needles. You can see that this is the cable for this needle, so it goes around here. So I'm definitely using the end of this needle tip to be able to knit onto the next round. And again, once I've gotten 4 or 5 stitches knit on the new needle, I can just pull this one up, pull it through to avoid any gaps in between needles and jogs that it might create. Just relax it into the crook of my thumb and forefinger, which works for me. It might not work for you. And I just carry that along, and it stays out of the way when gravity helps. Normally I'm not knitting for the camera, and so I'm knitting more upright, and so this comfortably falls into the crook of my thumb and forefinger, and stays out of the way a little bit more than it does for the videotaping purposes, but it's my technique for making sure it doesn't flop all around, and reminds me that that's the next needle tip I will use when I get to the end of this needle. So now that I've gotten to the end of this needle, I don't have to follow the cable around to know which needle I'm going to be using because it's been sitting in the crook of my thumb and forefinger. All I have to do is pull that through, bring those stitches up onto the next needle, and again start to knit in the round. One last time I'll show you. Pull those through and just rest that unused needle in the crook of the thumb and my forefinger and continue to knit round and round, half rounds at a time on each circular needle. So since I'm using an interchangeable set of needles, I don't have 4 US 8 tips. I only have 2. So what I do is I make sure that, since I know that I'm always knitting with this tip and I'm always knitting with this tip on the other needle, that on one side of my circular cable I put on the size that I need, US 8, and on the other side I put a US 7. The knitting part, when you're actually knitting in the round on circular cable needles, you're always working with the same front and back of the same needle, or the same leading edge and trailing edge of the same needle, right? As we discussed in the last section. And so as a result, if my stitches are coming off a US 7 tip and being knit with a US 8 tip, which they always are if I set them up this way, then it's the US 8 tip that establishes the size of the stitch and the gauge, not the trail end of the needle where the stitches are coming off of. That's just that's just kind of a stitch holder in essence, if you will, but it doesn't allow the stitch to get smaller just because it's a smaller size needle. You've already established and locked in the US 8 size stitch on this side, and so even though it's coming off the back end on this smaller size needle, it's still going to be the same gauge and it won't affect your gauge at all. So hopefully this tutorial was useful for you and that you enjoyed the tips and tricks and techniques. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I always answer any questions or clarifications that people need when it comes to this stuff. And I will also refer you to other techniques like magic loop or knitting on double pointed needles. So please feel free to leave comments or questions down there. I will get back to people who leave questions and comments there. Also, if you'd like to, you can certainly subscribe to my videos. It makes it easier for me to notify you when new videos and tutorials are out there that you might be interested in. So thanks again for listening.